At 65, he thought life was over. Then everything changed. An emotional new life story about starting again at 65 introduction. At 65 years old, Richard Bennett believed he had already lived the most important part of his life. For more than 40 years, he worked as a manager at a manufacturing company. Every day followed the same pattern. Wake up. Go to work. Come home. Sleep. Repeat. He spent decades building a career, paying bills, raising children, and taking care of responsibilities. And then one day retirement arrived. Everyone congratulated him. Everyone said, "Now you can relax." But Richard didn't want to relax. What he really wanted was something he couldn't explain. A reason to wake up in the morning. A reason to feel excited again. Because deep inside, he felt as though life had quietly stopped moving forward. What Richard didn't know was that his greatest adventure was about to begin. Chapter 1. The Empty Morning. The first month after retirement felt strange. At first it seemed enjoyable. No alarm clock. No stress. No deadlines. No meetings. But after a few weeks, the freedom started feeling like emptiness. One morning, Richard sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was silent. His wife Emma had gone shopping. His children lived in different cities. The television was off. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. For the first time in decades, he had nowhere to be. And somehow, that felt frightening. He stared out the window and whispered, "Do I do now?" There was no answer. Only silence. Chapter 2. The Mysterious Notebook. A few days later, Richard decided to clean the attic. Among old boxes and forgotten belongings, he found a small notebook. The cover was worn and faded. Curious, he opened it. Inside were handwritten pages from when he was 20 years old. As he read, he could hardly believe what he saw. It was a list. A list of dreams. Things he wanted to do in life. Travel across Europe. Write a book. Learn photography. Start a small business. Help people. See the northern lights. Richard sat down on an old wooden chair. For a long time he couldn't move. He had forgotten all of it. Somewhere between work bills and responsibilities, he had stopped dreaming. The young man who wrote those pages still existed somewhere inside him. He had simply been sleeping. Chapter 3. One Decision. That night, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the notebook. The next morning, he made a decision. A simple one. He would complete at least one dream from the list. Just one. No matter how small. He chose photography. The dream felt realistic. Interesting. Exciting. He bought a camera. Watched online lessons. Read books. Made mistakes. Lots of mistakes. But for the first time in years, he was learning something new. And learning made him feel alive. Chapter 4. The Stranger on the Train. One afternoon, Richard boarded a train to photograph the countryside. Across from him sat an elderly woman. He looked about 70. They began talking. Eventually, she asked, "What do you do?" Richard hesitated. For years, the answer had been easy. Now it wasn't. "I'm retired," he replied. The woman smiled. "That's not what I asked." Richard looked confused. "Then what did you mean?" The woman pointed toward his camera. "Who are you becoming?" The question stunned him. Who was he becoming? Not who had he been. Not what had he done. Who was he becoming, Al? The conversation lasted only 20 minutes. Yet it changed him forever. Chapter 5. The First Photograph. Months passed. Richard improved. One evening, while walking near a lake, he captured a photograph of a sunset. Golden light reflected across the water. Birds crossed the horizon. The image felt magical. Later, he posted it online. To his surprise, thousands of people viewed it. Hundreds left positive comments. One comment stood out. "This photo helped me smile during a difficult day." Richard read it 3 times. A simple photograph had brightened someone's life. For years, he thought his value came from his job. Now he realized he could still contribute to the world in different ways. Chapter 6. A New Dream. As confidence grew, Richard remembered another dream from the notebook. Travel. For decades he postponed it, always waiting for the perfect time. Now he understood something important. The perfect time rarely arrives. You created a... Within a year, Richard visited places he had only seen in books. Scotland, Norway, Italy, Iceland. Every journey brought new experiences, new friendships, new stories. And with every trip, he felt younger not in body, but in spirit. Chapter 7. The Young Photographer. One afternoon, Richard met a young man named Daniel. Daniel loved photography but lacked confidence. He constantly criticized his work. Richard saw himself in the young man, so he began mentoring him. Week after week they met, practiced, talked, learned. Eventually, Daniel's skills improved dramatically. One day, Daniel said, "You know something?" "What?" Richard asked. "You changed my life." Richard smiled. "No, you changed your own life. I just reminded you what was possible." For the first time, Richard realized his greatest purpose wasn't photography. It was encouraging others. Chapter 8. The Unexpected Invitation. 2 years after retirement, Richard received an email. A local gallery wanted to exhibit his photographs. At first he thought it was a mistake. Surely they had contacted the wrong person. But it was real. Months later, people filled the gallery. Visitors admired his work, asked questions, shared stories. One little girl stood in front of a landscape photograph and said, "I want to go there someday." Richard smiled. His work was inspiring people, not because he was famous, but because it came from genuine passion. Chapter 9. The New Life. On his 68th birthday, Richard sat on a hill overlooking the countryside. The wind moved gently through the grass. The sky was painted with colors of sunset. Emma sat beside him. "You seem happy," she said. Richard smiled. "I am." "More than when you were working?" He thought carefully. "Different." "How, Ella?" Richard looked toward the horizon. "When I was working, I was surviving. And now? Now I'm living." Final message. That evening, Richard opened the old notebook again. He looked at the list of dreams. Many had check marks beside them now. Others remained unfinished. And that made him smile. Because there were still adventures waiting. Still goals to achieve. Still people to meet. Still places to see. Still life to live. At 65, Richard thought he was reaching the end of the road. Instead, he discovered something beautiful. Age does not end dreams. Retirement does not end purpose. And life does not stop at 65. Sometimes, the most exciting chapter begins exactly where you thought the story was over. The end.
The day everything stopped. At 65 years old, Michael Carter believed his life had already been written. For 42 years, he worked as a train engineer in England. Every morning before sunrise, he wore his uniform, grabbed a cup of coffee, and headed to the station. The trains arrived. The trains departed. And Michael was always there. The job wasn't glamorous, but it gave him purpose. People depended on him. He was proud of that. Then one rainy Friday afternoon, it ended. The company held a retirement ceremony. There were speeches, handshakes, photographs, a cake decorated with the words, "Happy retirement, Michael." Everyone smiled. Everyone congratulated him. Yet deep inside, Michael felt something else. Fear. As he drove home, he looked at his reflection in the car mirror. For the first time in decades, he wasn't a train engineer anymore. He was simply Michael. And he wasn't sure who that person was. Chapter 2. The Longest Monday. The following Monday felt strange. At 5 a.m., Michael woke up automatically. His body still followed the old routine. He sat on the edge of his bed. Then he remembered. There was nowhere to go. No train to inspect. No passengers waiting. No schedule. The house felt unusually quiet. His wife, Susan, was still asleep. The neighborhood was silent. Michael made coffee and stared out the window. The sunrise looked exactly the same. Yet everything felt different. For the first time in 42 years, nobody expected anything from him. At first it sounded relaxing. By the second week, it felt unbearable. Days seemed endless. Television bored him. Newspapers bore him. Even his favorite hobbies felt empty. One afternoon he whispered to himself, "Is this it?" The question echoed through the room. Had he spent his entire life working only to sit and wait for time to pass? The thought frightened him. Chapter 3. A Chance Encounter. One morning Michael decided to walk around town. He needed fresh air. As he passed a small bookstore, he noticed an elderly man struggling to carry several boxes. Without thinking, Michael rushed over. "Need some help?" The man smiled. "I certainly do." Together, they carried the boxes inside. The bookstore owner introduced himself. His name was Arthur. He was 72 years old. After finishing, Arthur invited Michael for tea. During their conversation, Arthur asked, "What do you do?" Michael hesitated. The question suddenly felt difficult. "I used to be a train engineer." Arthur nodded. "And now?" Michael shrugged. "I don't know." Arthur laughed. "Excellent." Michael looked confused. "What's excellent about that?" Arthur smiled. "At 65, you get the rare opportunity to discover who you are without a job title." Those words stayed with Michael. Chapter 4. The Old Dream. A few days later, Michael was cleaning the garage. Behind several dusty boxes, he found an old camera. He picked it up carefully. Immediately, memories returned. When he was young, he loved photography. He spent hours taking pictures of people, landscapes, and city streets. He once dreamed of becoming a professional photographer. But life happened. Marriage, bills, children, responsibilities. The dream quietly disappeared. Holding the camera in his hands, he felt something awaken inside him. That evening, Susan noticed the camera. "You still have that?" Michael smiled. "I forgot about it." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time to remember." Chapter 5. Learning Again. The next day, Michael charged the camera battery. Then he walked through town taking photographs. At first, he felt awkward. He worried people might think he looked foolish. A retired man wandering around with a camera. But something unexpected happened. He enjoyed it very much. He photographed old buildings, street musicians, dogs playing in parks, children chasing pigeons, sunsets, rainstorms, life. The more photographs he took, the happier he felt. For the first time since retirement, he looked forward to tomorrow. Chapter 6. The Empty House. One evening, Michael sat quietly looking through old family albums. His children were grown now. They had families of their own. The house felt larger than it used to. Sometimes loneliness arrived without warning. He missed the busy years, the noise, the chaos, the laughter. Susan sat beside him. "What are you thinking about?" Michael smiled sadly. "I'm thinking about how fast everything went." She nodded. "It always does. I spent years trying to build a future. And now?" Michael looked at a photograph of his children. "Now, I realize the future became the past." Susan held his hand. "But we're still here." For some reason, those simple words brought comfort. Chapter 7. A new purpose. Several months later, Michael joined a community center. One day he offered to teach photography to teenagers. At first, only 4 students attended. Then 8. Then 15. The classes became popular. The students loved his stories. Michael loved their energy. One afternoon, a shy teenage girl approached him. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes. I never believed I was creative." She held up one of her photographs. "But because of your class, I think maybe I am." Michael felt tears forming in his eyes. For years he thought his purpose ended with his career. Now he realized purpose could take many forms. Sometimes purpose wasn't about earning money. Sometimes it was about helping someone believe in themselves. Chapter 8. The Unexpected Recognition. A local newspaper published several of Michael's photographs. Soon afterward, a gallery invited him to display his work. He couldn't believe it. At 65, he was experiencing achievements he never imagined. During the exhibition opening, visitors admired his pictures. Many asked the same question. When did you become a photographer? Michael smiled. At 65. People often laughed, assuming he was joking. But he wasn't. His second life had truly begun after retirement. Chapter 9. The Second Life. One autumn evening, Michael stood on a hill overlooking the city. His camera hung around his neck. The sunset painted the sky with shades of gold and orange. Susan stood beside him. Are you happy? She asked. Michael thought carefully. Then he answered. Happier than I expected. Why? He smiled. Because I spent years believing retirement was the end of the story. Susan nodded. And now? Michael looked at the horizon. Now I know it was only the end of one chapter. The wind moved gently across the hill. Birds crossed the evening sky. And for the first time in many years, Michael felt no fear about growing older. Because he had discovered a truth many people never learn. Life does not end when a career ends. Sometimes at 65, 68, or even 75, a completely new life is waiting to begin. And Michael Carter was finally living his. The end.
The last working day. In a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of London lived a man named David Thompson. At 65 years old, David had spent nearly 4 decades working for the same company. For 40 years, his life followed a predictable rhythm. Every morning the alarm clock rang at exactly 6 a.m. He would get out of bed, make himself a cup of tea, put on his old brown coat, and leave for work. The routine rarely changed. The seasons changed. Governments changed. Technology changed. But David's morning routine remained the same. His office had become more than just a workplace. It was a second home. It was where he had built a career, solved countless problems, shared laughter with colleagues, and overcome difficult challenges. But today was different. Today was his final day at work. As he stood outside the office building that morning, David paused before entering. The glass doors reflected an older version of himself, gray hair, gentle wrinkles around his eyes, and a face that carried decades of experience. He looked at the building and whispered quietly. 40 years. Where did the time go? Memories flooded his mind. His first nervous day as a young employee. The excitement of his first promotion. The late evenings spent finishing important projects. The friendships formed over coffee breaks. The difficult moments when deadlines seemed impossible. The celebrations after successful achievements. Every corner of the building held a story. Inside, the office was decorated with banners. His co-workers had planned a surprise farewell gathering. When David entered, everyone stood and applauded. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed. Sarah from accounting hugged him. We're going to miss you, David. Mark from the IT department smiled and said, The office won't be the same without you. David laughed softly. Every chapter ends someday, he replied. Otherwise, there would never be room for a new one to begin. During the farewell party, people shared stories about him. They talked about his kindness, his patience, his willingness to help anyone who needed support. One young employee stood up and said, When I joined this company, I was scared and unsure of myself. David was the first person who made me feel welcome. Those words touched David deeply. At the end of the celebration, his colleagues presented him with a beautifully wrapped gift. Inside was a photo album. Every page contained pictures from different years of his career. Alongside the photos were handwritten messages. Some were funny. Some were emotional. Some simply said, Thank you. As David turned the pages, his eyes filled with tears. At that moment, he realized something important. Money could pay the bills. Titles could earn respect. But genuine human connections were life's greatest wealth. When he left the building that evening, he carried the photo album carefully under his arm. For the first time in 40 years, he walked away knowing he would never return as an employee. The sky was painted orange by the setting sun. Yet instead of feeling free, David felt uncertain. A question echoed in his mind. Who am I now? Elle? For decades, his identity had been tied to his profession. He had always introduced himself as, "I'm David, I work at—" Now that sentence no longer existed. Without his job, who was he? L. When he arrived home, his wife Mary opened the door with a warm smile. She kissed his cheek and said, "Welcome to your new life." David laughed. "A new life? It feels more like the end of one." Mary shook her head. "No, David, it's the beginning of one." That night, after many years of stress and responsibility, David slept peacefully. Yet deep inside, a new journey had already begun. Chapter 2. The Fear of Empty Time. The first week of retirement felt strangely quiet. On Monday morning, David woke up at 6 a.m. as usual. His body still followed the old schedule. He sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment he panicked. Then he remembered. There was nowhere he needed to be. No meetings. No deadlines. No emails. No commute. At first it sounded wonderful. But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. Time moved painfully slowly. Hours seemed longer. Days stretched endlessly. David wandered around the house looking for things to do. He organized shelves, rearranged drawers, checked the mailbox multiple times, watched television, read newspapers. Yet nothing felt meaningful. One afternoon he sat on the sofa staring out the window. The silence felt heavy. Mary noticed. "What's bothering you?" she asked. David sighed. "I don't know." "Try." He looked down. "I feel unnecessary." Mary sat beside him. "What do you mean?" "For 40 years people needed me. My coworkers depended on me. My work mattered." He paused. "Now it feels like nobody needs me anymore." Mary gently took his hand. "David, your job was only one part of who you are. It doesn't feel that way." She smiled. "You were never just an employee." "What else am I?" "You're a husband." David looked at her. "You're a father." He nodded. "You're a friend." She squeezed his hand. "And most importantly, you're a good man." Those words stayed with him. For days. Perhaps she was right. Maybe he had spent so much time being a worker that he had forgotten the rest of himself. The next morning, David made a decision. He would stop waiting for purpose to find him. He would go searching for it. Chapter 3. Rediscovering the World. The following day, David went for a walk. At first it felt strange. Usually he would be driving to work at that hour. Now he wandered through the neighborhood without any destination. For the first time in years, he noticed details he had always ignored. The flowers blooming in front gardens. The laughter of children walking to school. The sound of birds singing from trees. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. Life had always been there. He had simply been too busy to notice it. An elderly man sitting on a bench smiled at him. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" David smiled back. "Yes, it really is." As he continued walking, he realized something surprising. The world had not become less interesting after retirement. If anything, it had become richer. Because now he finally had time to see it. For years he had rushed through life. Now life invited him to slow down. And perhaps for the first time, truly live. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Dream. A few weeks later, while cleaning the attic, David discovered an old cardboard box covered in dust. Curious, he opened it. Inside were sketchbooks, pencils, paintbrushes, and dozens of drawings. He stared at them in disbelief. As a child and teenager, David had loved drawing. He once dreamed of becoming an artist. But adulthood arrived. Bills needed paying. Responsibilities grew. Dreams were quietly placed in boxes and forgotten. Until now. Mary climbed into the attic and found him sitting among the drawings. "What are you looking at?" David held up a sketch. I drew this when I was 16. Mary examined it. It's beautiful. David smiled sadly. I haven't drawn anything in decades. Why not start again? He laughed. At 65? Mary laughed too. Do dreams have an expiration date? David had no answer. The next day he bought new art supplies. And that simple decision changed everything. Chapter 5. Learning to Begin Again. The first drawing was terrible. David laughed at his own mistakes. His hands felt rusty. His confidence was gone. But he kept practicing. Every day. 1 hour became 2. 2 became 3. Soon painting became the highlight of his day. Weeks turned into months. The joy he felt as a young boy slowly returned. And with it came something unexpected. Hope. For the first time since retirement, David stopped focusing on what he had lost. Instead, he focused on what he could still become. Chapter 6. New Friends, New Journeys. At the local park, David met other retirees. John had started gardening.
The last goodbye. For more than 40 years, David Wilson lived by the clock. At 6 o'clock every morning, his alarm rang. At 6:30, he drank his tea. At 7 o'clock, he left home wearing the same navy blue coat he had worn for years. By 8 o'clock, he was sitting at his desk in the accounting department of a large company in London. The routine had become part of him. In many ways, it was him. At 63 years old, David had spent most of his adult life working. He was known as a reliable employee, a dependable colleague, and a hard-working professional. Whenever someone introduced him, they would say, "This is David. He works for Westbridge Financial." His job had become his identity. Then one day, everything changed. Retirement arrived. The date that had once seemed so far away was suddenly here. On his final day, David walked through the office doors more slowly than usual. He looked around carefully. The walls, the desks, the meeting rooms, the coffee machine where he had shared countless conversations. Everything seemed ordinary, yet everything felt different. His co-workers organized a farewell gathering. There were speeches. There were jokes. There were memories. Some people laughed. Some cried. One colleague stood up and said, "David taught us that success isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the kindest." The room filled with applause. David smiled, but his heart felt heavy. As he packed the last few items from his desk, a strange feeling settled inside him. For 40 years, he had known exactly where he belonged. Tomorrow, he would wake up without a workplace, without a title, without a schedule, without a reason to leave the house. As he drove home that evening, a question kept repeating in his mind. Who am I without my job? Chapter 2. The Silence. The first Monday of retirement arrived. At exactly 6 a.m., David's eyes opened. His body had not yet learned that life had changed. For a moment he forgot he was retired. Then reality returned. There was nowhere to go. No meetings. No deadlines. No emails waiting. No reports to finish. At first, it felt relaxing. But by the second week, something unexpected happened. The silence became uncomfortable. The days felt unusually long. Hours passed slowly. David wandered around the house looking for things to do. He watched television. He organized drawers. He read old magazines. Yet nothing brought satisfaction. One afternoon, he sat in the living room, staring at the rain outside. His wife, Mary, noticed his mood. "You've been quiet lately," she said. David sighed. "I feel useless." Mary looked surprised. "Why would you say that?" "Because nobody needs me anymore." The words escaped before he could stop them. Mary sat beside him. She took his hand gently. "David, you spent 40 years working." "Exactly." "No," Mary replied softly. "You spent 40 years believing that your value came from your work." David remained silent. Mary continued. "You were important before your career. You were important during your career. And you're important after your career." Those words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Chapter 3. A walk that changed everything. The next morning, David decided to go for a walk. He had no destination, no schedule, no purpose, just a simple walk. As he moved through the neighborhood, he noticed things he had never paid attention to before. A gardener carefully planting flowers, a mother holding her child's hand on the way to school, an elderly couple sitting on a bench sharing breakfast, birds singing in the trees, the smell of fresh bread coming from a nearby bakery. For years these things had existed around him, but he had always been too busy to notice. Suddenly he realized something. Life had not become smaller after retirement. Life had become larger. The world was full of moments he had been rushing past for decades. For the first time in years, David felt curious again. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Dream. One rainy afternoon, David decided to clean the attic. While moving old boxes, he discovered something unexpected. A dusty sketchbook. He opened it. Inside were drawings he had created when he was a teenager. Landscapes, portraits, buildings, animals. As he turned the pages, memories flooded back. When he was young, David loved drawing. He dreamed of becoming an artist. But life had taken a different path. Bills needed paying. Children needed raising. Responsibilities came first. The dream had quietly disappeared. Mary found him sitting on the attic floor. "What are you looking at?" she asked. David showed her the sketchbook. "I haven't seen these in 40 years. Mary smiled. "They're beautiful." David laughed. "Maybe they were." "No," Mary said. "They still are." After a moment she asked, "Why don't you start again?" David looked at her as if she had suggested something impossible. "At my age." Mary laughed. "Dreams don't have birthdays." Chapter 5. Starting over. The next day, David bought pencils, paints, and a sketch pad. The first drawing was terrible. The second wasn't much better. His hands felt clumsy. His confidence was gone. Yet something inside him felt alive. For the first time since retirement, he was excited to wake up. Every morning he practiced. Every afternoon he learned. Every evening he improved. Weeks became months. Slowly, the joy he remembered from childhood returned. He wasn't trying to become famous. He wasn't trying to make money. He was simply doing something that made him happy. And that happiness began changing every part of his life. Chapter 6. New Friends, New Beginnings. During his daily walks, David began meeting other retirees. There was George, who had started learning Italian at 68. There was Robert, who volunteered at a local library. There was Helen, who had begun writing novels after retirement. Each person had discovered a new purpose. Each person had created a new chapter. One afternoon, they sat together in the park. George said, "People think retirement means life slows down." Robert laughed. "For me, life finally started." Everyone smiled. David realized something important. Growing older did not mean becoming less useful. It meant becoming free to focus on what truly mattered. Chapter 7. Returning to family. During his working years, David had missed many important moments. School performances, family vacations, weekend adventures, even simple dinners. Work had always come first. Now he had time. Real time. One evening his daughter invited him to watch her son's football match. After the game, his grandson ran toward him. "Grandpa, did you see my goal?" David smiled. "I saw every second." The boy hugged him tightly. In that moment, David felt a happiness no promotion had ever given him. He realized that success was not measured only by income or achievements. Sometimes success was measured by presence, by being there, by sharing moments with the people you love. Chapter 8. A Test of Love. One winter, Mary became seriously ill. For several months, she required extra care. David stayed by her side every day. He prepared meals. He managed medications. He drove her to appointments. He sat beside her during difficult nights. One evening, Mary looked at him and smiled. "You know something?" "What?" "You've become my hero." David laughed softly. "I'm just taking care of my wife." Mary shook her head. "No." She squeezed his hand. "You're showing me what love looks like after 40 years. Those words touched him deeply. Retirement had given him something work never could. Time. And time allowed him to love more fully. Chapter 9. Sharing his gift. A local community center organized an art exhibition. David almost didn't participate. He doubted himself. But Mary encouraged him. "Let people see what you've created." Reluctantly, he submitted 3 paintings. To his surprise, visitors loved them. Many stopped to admire his work. One young man approached him and said, "Your paintings inspire me." David smiled. "How?" The young man replied, "Because they remind me that it's never too late to follow a dream." David stood silently for a moment. Then he realized his journey wasn't only helping him, it was helping others too. Chapter 10. A New Morning. A year after retirement, David sat in his garden watching the sunrise. The sky slowly filled with gold and orange colors. Birds sang from nearby trees. A gentle breeze moved through the flowers. Mary joined him with 2 cups of tea. She sat beside him. "Do you remember how frightened you were when you retired?" she asked. David smiled. "Very well. And now?" He looked toward the rising sun. "I understand something I didn't understand before." "What is it?" David thought carefully. Then he answered, "Retirement isn't the end of life. It's the beginning of a different life." Mary smiled. "A better one?" David looked around. At the garden. At the morning light. At the home they had built together. At the future still waiting ahead. Then he nodded. "Not better. Just deeper." And as the sun climbed higher into the sky, David felt grateful. Grateful for the years behind him. Grateful for the years ahead. Because he had finally learned an important truth. Life does not stop at 50. Life does not stop at 60. Life does not stop when a career ends. Sometimes the most beautiful chapter begins after retirement. Sometimes the most meaningful mornings arrive after the alarm clock no longer rings. And sometimes, what looks like an ending is simply the beginning of a new sunrise. The end. A new morning after retirement. Chapter 11. The letter he never wrote. One afternoon, while organizing old documents, David found a notebook hidden in the back of a cabinet. The pages were yellow with age. Inside were notes he had written when he was 30 years old. Goals, dreams, plans for the future. As he read through them, he smiled. Some dreams had come true. Others had not. One page caught his attention. At the top, he had written, "A letter to my future self." The page was blank. He had never finished it. David sat quietly for a long time. Then he picked up a pen. Slowly, he began writing. "Dear younger David, you worried too much. You thought success meant working harder than everyone else. You thought happiness would arrive someday in the future. You were wrong. Happiness was always around you, in your family, your friendships, your quiet moments. I wish you had noticed sooner." When he finished, tears filled his eyes. For the first time, he felt peace with the life he had lived. Not because it had been perfect, but because it had been meaningful. Chapter 12. The Empty Bench. Every morning during his walks, David passed a wooden bench in the park. An elderly man often sat there feeding birds. For months they exchanged smiles. Then one day, the bench was empty. The next day, it was empty again. And the day after that. Finally, David asked a nearby gardener about him. The gardener sighed. "He passed away last week." David stood silently. The news affected him more than he expected. He had never even learned the man's name. Yet his absence felt significant. That evening David couldn't stop thinking about him. Life was fragile. People appeared and disappeared. No one knew how much time remained. That realization changed something inside him. Instead of fearing aging, he began appreciating each day more deeply. Every sunrise became a gift. Every conversation became valuable. Every ordinary moment became extraordinary. Chapter 13. The Young Neighbor. A young man named Ethan moved into the house next door. He was 26 years old and worked long hours. David often saw him leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. One evening Ethan sat outside looking frustrated. "Tough day?" David asked. Ethan laughed bitterly. "Tough year." David sat beside him. The young man explained that he felt lost. He wasn't sure if he had chosen the right career. He constantly compared himself to others. Nothing seemed enough. David listened quietly. Then he smiled. "When I was your age, I thought life was a race." Ethan nodded. "It feels like one." David shook his head. "No, life is a journey. What's the difference? A race is about arriving first. A journey is about learning along the way." The young man sat silently. Years later, Ethan would remember those words. Sometimes wisdom arrives from people who have already walked the road ahead. Chapter 14. The Dream Trip. For decades, David and Mary had talked about visiting Scotland. They always postponed it. There was never enough time. Work came first. Responsibilities came first. Everything came first. Until now. One spring morning, Mary placed a travel brochure on the kitchen table. David smiled. "What's this?" "Our trip." David laughed. "Just like that." Mary nodded. "If not now, when?" A month later, they were driving through the Scottish Highlands. Rolling green hills stretched to the horizon. Ancient castles stood proudly against the sky. The air felt fresh and free. One evening, they stood beside a quiet lake, watching the sunset. Mary slipped her hand into David's. "We waited 30 years for this." David smiled. "Maybe that's why I feel so special." For the first time in decades, there was nowhere they needed to be. Nothing demanding their attention. Just two people enjoying the gift of time together. Chapter 15. A New Challenge. At 64, David decided to learn something completely new. Computers had always intimidated him. Technology changed so quickly. He often felt left behind. One day his grandson laughed and said, "Grandpa, I'll teach you." And so the lessons began. At first David struggled. Simple tasks seemed complicated. He made mistakes, pressed the wrong buttons, forgot passwords. Yet he refused to quit. Week after week, he improved. Soon he was editing photos of his paintings, video calling relatives, researching places he wanted to visit. One evening he looked at his grandson and smiled. "You know, learning doesn't get easier with age." The boy laughed. "Then why keep doing it?" David smiled. "Because growing older doesn't mean growing finished." Chapter 16. The Storm. Not every day was happy. Not every chapter was easy. 1 year after retirement, David faced a difficult period. Several close friends experienced health problems. One friend moved into assisted care. Another passed away unexpectedly. The reality of aging became impossible to ignore. For a while, David felt sad. He became quiet, thoughtful, reflective. One evening Mary found him sitting alone in the garden. "What are you thinking about?" David looked toward the stars. "I'm thinking about time." Mary sat beside him. "Time can be scary." David nodded. "It can." After a long pause he added, "But maybe that's why every day matters so much." Mary smiled. Perhaps that was the secret. Life's value comes from the fact that it is temporary. The limited number of days makes each one precious. Chapter 17. The Community Project. A local school invited retired residents to mentor students. David volunteered. Every Wednesday he spent time with teenagers who needed encouragement. Some struggled with confidence. Some struggled with family problems. Others simply needed someone to listen. David shared stories from his life. Not stories about success. Stories about mistakes, failures, lessons learned. The students appreciated his honesty. One girl said, "Adults usually act like they've never been confused." David laughed. "I was confused for most of my life." The room erupted with laughter. Over time, David became an important mentor. He discovered that experience was a gift worth sharing. Chapter 18. The Painting. 2 years after retirement, David completed the largest painting he had ever created. It showed a sunrise over a calm ocean, warm light breaking through darkness, hope emerging from uncertainty. When Mary saw it, she became emotional. "It's beautiful." David looked at the painting quietly. "It isn't really about the ocean." "What is it about?" He smiled. "It's about retirement." Mary laughed. "Retirement?" David nodded. "When I retired, I thought the sun was setting." He pointed toward the painting, but it was actually rising. Chapter 19. The Grandchildren. The greatest joy of David's later years arrived unexpectedly. Not through hobbies, not through travel, not through achievements. Through his grandchildren. They filled the house with laughter, questions, energy, curiosity. One afternoon his granddaughter asked, "Grandpa, are you old?" David laughed. "Probably." She thought carefully. "You don't seem old." "Why not?" "Because you're always learning things." David smiled. Children often understand truths adults forget. Growing old is not about age. It is about stopping curiosity. And David had no intention of doing that. Chapter 20. The Most Beautiful Morning. On his 65th birthday, David woke before sunrise. The house was quiet. The world was still asleep. He stepped into the garden with a cup of tea. As the first light appeared across the sky, he reflected on the journey. The fear he felt when retirement began. The uncertainty. The loneliness. the questions, and then the discoveries, the friendships, the adventures, the family moments, the new dreams, the deeper appreciation for life. Mary joined him outside. Together they watched the sunrise. After a while she asked, "If you could speak to the person you were on your last day of work, what would you say?" David smiled. The answer came easily. "I would tell him not to be afraid." Mary nodded. "Anything else?" David looked toward the brightening horizon. "Yes, I would tell him that retirement is not the end of usefulness. It's not the end of purpose. It's not the end of adventure. It's not the end of growth." He paused. "It's simply the beginning of a new morning." And as the sun rose higher, David felt grateful for every chapter of his life, because he finally understood something many people spend years trying to learn. The best part of life is not always behind us. Sometimes, the most beautiful chapter is the one we haven't lived yet. The end.
What would you do if tomorrow morning you woke up and realized you no longer had a job to go to? No office. No meetings. No deadlines. No routine. For most people, retirement sounds like freedom. But for 65-year-old James Parker, it felt like losing a part of himself. After working for 43 years without missing a single week, retirement arrived. Everyone congratulated him. Everyone told him to enjoy life. But nobody warned him about the loneliness. Nobody warned him about the silence. And nobody told him that the biggest challenge of his life would begin after his career ended. This is the emotional story of a man who thought his best years were behind him. Until one unexpected event changed everything. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more inspiring life stories that touch the heart. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, The Day the Clock Stopped. For 43 years, James Parker lived by the clock. At exactly 5:30 every morning, he woke up. At 6 o'clock, he drank coffee. At 6:30, he left for work. The routine never changed. Rain or sunshine. Winter or summer. Good days or bad days. James showed up. His co-workers respected him. His boss trusted him. His family admired his dedication. Work wasn't just something he did. Work was who he was. Then one Friday afternoon, it ended. His retirement ceremony was held in the company cafeteria. People applauded. Photos were taken. Speeches were given. Everyone smiled. Yet inside, James felt empty. As he carried a box of personal belongings to his car, a strange fear appeared. For the first time in decades, nobody would need him on Monday morning. And that thought terrified him. Chapter 2, The First Week. The first few days felt wonderful. James slept later. Watched television. Relaxed in the garden. Enjoyed long breakfasts. It felt like a vacation. But vacations end. Retirement didn't. By the second week, boredom arrived. Then loneliness. Then doubt. One afternoon he sat in complete silence. The house felt too quiet. The rooms felt too large. For the first time, he wondered if retirement had been a mistake. His wife Linda noticed his mood. "You seem unhappy." James forced a smile. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." He looked away. "I don't know what my purpose is anymore." Linda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked a simple question. "When was the last time you did something just because you loved it?" James couldn't remember. Chapter 3, The Unexpected Discovery. A few days later, James entered the garage searching for old tools. Instead, he found something else. A guitar. Covered in dust. Forgotten for nearly 30 years. He picked it up carefully. Instantly, memories returned. When he was young, he loved music. He dreamed of performing. He dreamed of writing songs. But adulthood arrived. Dreams were replaced by responsibilities. The guitar was stored away. And eventually forgotten. Until now. That evening, he cleaned it. Replaced the strings. And played his first chord in decades. It sounded terrible. But it made him smile. For the first time in months, he felt alive. Chapter 4, The Man in the Park. Every morning, James began practicing guitar. Then he started taking walks. One day in the park, he heard beautiful music. An elderly man sat beneath a tree playing violin. People stopped to listen. Children danced. Strangers smiled. The musician looked at least 75 years old. After the performance, James approached him. "You play wonderfully." The old man smiled. "Thank you. When did you start?" The man laughed. "At 70. James blinked. 70. The man nodded. I retired. Got bored. Bought a violin. James couldn't believe it. You're telling me you learned all this after 70? The man smiled. We stop living when we stop learning. Those words followed James home. Chapter 5, A New Mission. The next morning, James made a decision. Instead of counting the years behind him, he would focus on the years ahead. He created a list. Things he always wanted to do. Learn music. Travel. Volunteer. Read more books. Meet new people. Help others. The list surprised him. His life wasn't finished. There were still dreams waiting. Still experiences waiting. Still adventures waiting. For the first time since retirement, he felt excited about the future. Chapter 6, The Teenager Who Changed Everything. One afternoon, James noticed a teenage boy sitting alone in the park. The boy looked upset. After several meetings, they eventually started talking. His name was Ryan. Ryan struggled with confidence. He believed he would never succeed. James listened carefully. Then he shared stories about his own failures. The jobs he didn't get. The mistakes he made. The fears he carried. Ryan looked surprised. You were scared too? James laughed. More times than you can imagine. Over time, an unlikely friendship developed. And James discovered something powerful. His experience could help others. His age was not a weakness. It was a gift. Chapter 7, The Community Concert. A year later, James joined a local music group. They organized a charity concert. James almost refused to perform. He was nervous. Embarrassed. Afraid of making mistakes. Then he remembered something. The biggest regrets in life often come from opportunities we never take. So he stepped onto the stage. The audience applauded. His hands trembled. His heart raced. Then he started playing. Something magical happened. The fear disappeared. The music took over. When the final note ended, the crowd stood and cheered. At 66 years old, James experienced something he had dreamed about as a teenager. Not because he was young, but because he finally gave himself permission to try. Chapter 8, The Real Meaning of Retirement. One evening, James sat on his porch watching the sunset. Linda joined him. They sat quietly for several minutes. Then she asked, "Do you miss work?" James smiled. "Sometimes." "And retirement?" He looked at the sky. "When I retired, I thought life was closing a door. What do you think now?" James smiled. "I think life was opening one." The sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. For years, James believed retirement was about stopping. Now he understood the truth. Retirement isn't about ending. It's about beginning again. A second chance. A second dream. A second life. And sometimes, the second life becomes the best one. Studio microphone ending message. If you're approaching retirement, already retired, or wondering whether your best years are behind you, remember James. At 65, he thought his story was over. At 66, he discovered a brand new chapter. Because life doesn't end when work ends. Sometimes. That's when the real adventure begins. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more heartwarming and inspiring life stories. Red Heart.
The day he thought it was over. At 65 years old, Richard Bennett stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared at the man looking back at him. The gray hair. The wrinkles around his eyes. The tired expression. For a moment, he hardly recognized himself. It wasn't because he looked old. It was because he felt lost. Only 6 months earlier, Richard had retired after 43 years of work. For decades, life had been simple. Every day had a purpose. Every morning had a destination. Every week had a schedule. Now the schedule was gone. The purpose felt uncertain. And every morning seemed exactly the same. Many people imagined retirement as endless happiness. Richard had imagined it too. Long mornings. Peaceful afternoons. Freedom from responsibility. But the reality felt different. The freedom he once wanted had slowly turned into emptiness. The silence inside the house felt louder every day. And deep inside, a frightening question kept appearing. Have I already lived the best years of my life? At the time, Richard didn't know the answer. But life was about to teach him something remarkable. The best years weren't behind him. They were still waiting ahead. Chapter 1. The house that felt too quiet. The first year of retirement was harder than Richard expected. His wife Emma noticed it immediately. Every morning he wandered through the house looking for something to do. He opened the refrigerator repeatedly. Checked his phone every few minutes. Watched television without paying attention. Read newspapers he wasn't interested in. Nothing held his attention. One afternoon, Emma found him sitting at the dining table staring out the window. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Richard shrugged. "Nothing." Emma smiled knowingly. "That's exactly the problem." Richard laughed softly. Maybe she was right. For 43 years his mind had been occupied. Problems to solve. Projects to finish. People to help. Decisions to make. Now there was too much empty space. And the human mind often fills empty space with worry. One evening Richard admitted something he had been hiding. "I don't think I'm happy." Emma looked at him carefully. "Do you miss work?" "A little." "Or do you miss feeling needed?" The question hit him hard. Because deep down he knew the answer. He missed feeling useful. Chapter 2, The Forgotten Box. Several weeks later, Richard began cleaning the garage. In one corner sat an old wooden box covered in dust. He almost threw it away. Then curiosity stopped him. Inside were dozens of items from his younger years. Photographs. Letters. Books. Old journals. Ticket stubs from places he had visited decades ago. And underneath everything else, he found a faded envelope. Written across the front were 4 words. "Open at age 65. Richard froze. The handwriting was his own. His younger self had written it. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. "Dear future Richard, if you're reading this, you've reached 65. I hope you never stopped dreaming. I hope you traveled. I hope you learned new things. I hope you never became afraid of change. And if life didn't go exactly as planned, that's okay too. Just promise me one thing. Don't spend your remaining years looking backward. Keep moving forward." Richard sat silently for a long time. The letter felt like a message from another lifetime. From a younger version of himself who still believed anything was possible. For the first time in months, something stirred inside him. Hope. Chapter 3, The Bucket List. The following day, Richard bought a notebook. On the first page he wrote, "Things I still want to do." At first the page remained blank. Then slowly ideas appeared. Learn photography. Visit Iceland. Write a book. Volunteer. Learn to play piano. See the northern lights. Start exercising again. Make new friends. Help someone achieve their dream. The list grew longer. And with every item, Richard felt something returning. Excitement. For the first time since retirement, the future looked interesting again. Chapter 4, The Journey Begins. Richard decided not to wait. Too many people spend years waiting for the perfect moment. He understood now that perfect moments rarely arrive. You create them. The next week he enrolled in a photography class. Most of the students were younger. Some were young enough to be his grandchildren. At first he felt uncomfortable. Out of place. Too old. Then the instructor said something unexpected. Experience is your advantage. Richard never forgot those words. While younger students focused on technique, Richard noticed emotions. Stories. Moments. Years of life experience helped him see things differently. And soon, his photographs began standing out. Chapter 5, The Coffee Shop Meeting. One rainy afternoon, Richard entered a small coffee shop. Every table was occupied except one. A woman around his age sat nearby reading a book. Eventually, they started talking. Her name was Margaret. She had retired 3 years earlier. Like Richard, she struggled at first. She explained. Retirement isn't hard because you stop working. Richard nodded. Then why is it hard? Margaret smiled. Because you have to rediscover who you are. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Before leaving, they exchanged numbers. A friendship began. Then another. Then another. Gradually, Richard built a circle of friends who were all creating new lives after retirement. Together they traveled. Shared stories. Supported one another. Laughed often. And reminded each other that life was far from over. Chapter 6, The Mountain. At 67 years old, Richard attempted something that shocked everyone. He decided to hike a mountain. Nothing extreme, but challenging enough. His children thought he was crazy. His grandchildren laughed. His doctor raised an eyebrow. Yet Richard trained for months. walking every day, eating healthier, building strength. Finally, the day arrived. The climb was difficult. His legs hurt. His lungs burned. Several times he considered turning back. But he kept going. Step by step. Hour by hour. Until finally he reached the summit. Standing at the top, looking across endless valleys and distant hills, Richard felt tears in his eyes. Not because of the view. Because of what it represented. He had spent years believing age was a limitation. Now he understood something different. The biggest limitations often exist only in the mind. Chapter 7, the book. At 68, Richard began writing. Not because he wanted fame. Not because he wanted money. Simply because he had stories to tell. Every morning he wrote for 2 hours. At first it felt difficult. Then natural. Then enjoyable. Months became a year. Eventually the manuscript was finished. Holding the completed book in his hands felt incredible. 40 years earlier, he had dreamed of becoming a writer. Now, decades later, the dream finally came true. Not because he was talented, but because he started. Chapter 8, The Young Man. One day after a photography exhibition, a young man approached Richard. He looked nervous. Can I ask you something? Of course. The young man hesitated. I'm 30 years old. Richard smiled. That's young. The man laughed. I don't feel young. Why, L? I think I'm running out of time. Richard couldn't help smiling. Because he remembered feeling exactly the same at 30. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Let me tell you a secret. What? Richard looked him in the eye. You have far more time than you think. The young man's expression softened. And Richard realized something. Wisdom is one of the greatest gifts of growing older. Chapter 9, The Northern Lights. At 70 years old, Richard finally completed the dream that had remained on his list for decades. He traveled to Norway. One freezing night he stood beneath the Arctic sky. The world was silent. Then suddenly it happened. Green waves of light began dancing across the darkness. The Northern Lights. More beautiful than he had imagined. For nearly an hour he stood there watching. A childlike smile spread across his face. In that moment, he thought about the younger Richard who had written the letter years ago. The young man who believed life would always offer new possibilities. He had been right. Chapter 10, The New Morning. Several years after retirement, Richard sat in his garden watching the sunrise. Birds sang softly. The air felt fresh. The sky glowed gold. Emma joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. You're smiling, she said. Richard nodded. I was remembering. What? The day I retired. Emma laughed. You were miserable. I know. They both smiled. After a moment she asked, what would you tell that version of yourself now? Richard looked toward the rising sun. His answer came slowly. I would tell him not to be afraid. Not to believe that life ends with a career. Not to confuse retirement with an ending. He paused. Then added, because retirement isn't the end of purpose. It's the beginning of freedom. It's the chance to become the person you've always wanted to be. The sun climbed higher. The garden filled with light. And Richard felt grateful. Not because everything had been easy. Not because life had been perfect. But because he had discovered a truth many people never learn. Life doesn't end at